Hey everyone, in episode 20, I'm speaking with Danny Wasserman, Director of Go-to-Market Enablement at Gong, on the topic of behavioral economics, decision science, and generally how to use the research around influence and persuasion to help salespeople be more effective. Whilst we do dive into the science and get a little nerdy from time to time, this episode is full of practical tips on how to apply the theory of persuasion and decision science in very practical ways, whether that's in your go-to-market messaging, sales conversations, or throughout your entire sales process. Danny goes into detail on why it's important to create a level of tension with your prospects, how to use Kahneman's prospect theory without it feeling overly negative, and where people should start if they want to know how to apply these techniques in their own world of sales. I had a lot of fun recording this episode with Danny, with someone who is equally as passionate, if not more so, on a topic of behavioral economics. So let's jump into the show and see what this episode has in store. Hey, Danny, great to see you again, buddy. How is life treating you? Where are you now? Because you seem to be doing the world tour.
Oh, man, Dan. Well, as a fellow namesake, it is just a warm and fuzzy feeling to be back chatting with you. I am, of all places, in another, we'll stick with alliteration. I'm in Denver, Colorado, where I allegedly reside, but having just come back late last night from Chicago and then plans to probably hit the road next week as well over to New York. So you're catching me in a rare moment with the backdrop of my home.
Got the home comforts. Got all the. I just got back after a little bit of a trip, and I live close to my parents. This is a really sad admission at the beginning of a podcast, and please, people, don't judge me. But my mum cleaned out my fridge. She said I left some stuff in the fridge that didn't want to be left in the fridge. So hopefully, either A, your family have taken care of you and cleaned everything out, or B, you're a little bit more grown up than I am. And you actually think about those things before you go away.
Maybe that just speaks more to the fact that you've cashed away enough points and chips where you can call in on mom and say, hey, I'm in a pickle. Maybe it was pickles that you threw away, in fact.
Hopefully, I do like the pickles. The longer they stay in there, the better they are. We're going into some strange territory. I'm going to try and bring us back into the land of sales enablement and a topic that, to be honest, I thought I was only, it was me in a small group of like nerdiness that was really interested in the topic that we're going to talk about and actually dived into it, kind of opened some books, read some papers and stuff. But what we're going to talk about today is behavioral economics and decision science and the way that people think about it. We're salespeople trying to influence people and get them to do something differently. It makes sense to me that we should probably go and study the other side, that we should study the way our brains work, that we think about problems. And when a salesperson comes and tries to convince us to do something, that we understand and we unpack that thought process. So decision science, influence, persuasion, that's the topic. But, like I said, I'm a nerd. I go weird places. How did you find out about this stuff? And what was the point that you realized that, okay, I can see how we apply this into sales?
For sure. I think even before we talk about my awakening and discovery of the science and the psych and economics and how does it all intersect to become this, playbook that's much more scientific, to keep quoting you, I think I need to share, I was a seller. And I was a seller and I carried the bag. I was a commercial seller, I was an enterprise seller. And for those who are listening, the job's hard. And so many folks before us have tried to make this repeatable. They've tried to demystify it. They've tried to unpack what is the secret sauce that earns you with a higher degree of confidence that ticket to President's Club every year. The reality is some of it's right place, right time. Some of it's just the beautiful art of it, which isn't repeatable. But when I looked at enablement, I said, I'm never going to be in enablement. They're washed up. They don't actually know what's going on. Those who can't do teach. Like, take every adage you can imagine that poo-poos enablement. And that's how I felt. I was really cynical about it. And credit goes to my boss and mentor, Nate Vogel, for persuading me that we could bring more credence and legitimacy to this profession. So I'm being long-winded, but I'm almost getting to your question, Dan, which is, okay, how did I stumble upon this? Well, as a former seller, I didn't want someone on stage pontificating at me for an hour when I was a seller, because time is money and they're telling me things I already know. Well, I thought if we bring science to the discussion, if we bring recognizable, authoritative experts and citations to how the brain receives our desperate attempts at trying to convince someone to do something different, well, all of a sudden, it added greater legitimacy to the sales profession. And I think that when you harmonize efforts from sales, which historically have been through hook or crook, with, oh my God, what if we empowered these folks with a higher probability, not a sure thing. There is no silver bullet. So if you think that, oh my God, Dan and I are going to tell you, use this as the antidote and the panacea, and voila, all of your sales dreams will come true, you are fooling yourself. That doesn't exist. And if it did, Dan and I would be calling you from our private islands because we would have cracked the code. No, we're giving you hopefully a heightened sense of legitimacy that you have a right to be in that room. And internally, the belief that at least from a statistical probability, you're using the brain's hardwiring deliberately and against itself, almost, if you're Christopher Nolan fans out there, incepting them. So I hope that answers your question.
I love the Inception reference. A few of my friends will jump on that one and probably ping me. But what you said there is we're taking, and this is the frustration as a very long time enabler and former bag carrier as well, is this idea that a lot of people fall into sales. They have the gift of the gab. They're nice and likable. They can chat good stuff. But we're turning it into a profession where you can study science. You can actually study the content as you would in any other profession. There's a detailed and scientific approach to take. So I love that. And I think that's super important. You said a whole bunch of things there in terms of application, not standing on stage and just shouting things out and turning this in. So what was it for you? Was there one thing that you thought, like, that you first learned? Like, where did you first kind of find, what was the gateway piece of content for you to dive into this in more detail?
I can remember a seminal moment early on in my enablement career. It wasn't actually in my sales career, but I remember seeing Jim Druckery, who leads the consulting practice over at Corporate Visions. And you'll know that I'm a CVI fanboy, unabashedly, unapologetically. So Jim, I'll send you this episode. But there's a moment in his opening when he hits you between the eyes with a hard truth and a counterintuitive, not so obvious hard truth. And he talks about how do you, he being a former C-suite executive for large Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies, the tendency that sellers have to over-index in their approaches to talking about themselves, to talking about their latest product, talking about some new initiative, maybe attempting to deliver a new message that in actuality has nothing to do with Jim or Jim's business.
Yeah.
And what he presents are not Jim's beliefs and opinions as an executive, which hold weight, sure, but he presents two different discoveries, one from Forrester and the other from Serious Decisions, equally recognizable and authoritative in their integrity as research firms and consultancies. He talks about that, 88% of sellers are ill-equipped to talk about business acumen, grade topics, the forces that influence how Jim and his team and his board make decisions. 88% are ill-equipped. And yet, on the flip side, the recipients of those fledgling attempts from sellers like yours truly, well, a receiver of that attempt wants to have that business level conversation 4 times more than any attempt to describe products or new rollouts and upgrades. So you have what he refers to as the business acumen gap. And I just remember thinking, holy shit, like what our ideal prospecting target wants 4 times more, they get maybe 12% of the time. Yeah. And thinking, do I fall within that rarefied air or not? And I just remember it was Forrester and Sirius and numbers, and it was also tension. And he wasn't afraid to induce tension. You know, we can talk a lot more about that in this episode, but that was a turning point. It was like, I just saw mastery, and I want to replicate that in anything I do as I continue my career in enablement.
Yeah. Tension's a big one, right? And we're going to talk about, and I love the Corporate Visions content as well. And change is the big thing. It's like, why change? That's the start of their message, right? Change is, and we'll also kind of, the opposite of change is no change, which is this thing about status quo. We'll get into that. But change requires tension, but salespeople like to be liked. And, if you look at the challenger sale, the relationship builder who just goes out and makes friends, but never actually creates that element of tension, gets blown out of the water in many cases, right? I think they're way down, but the challenger is able to kind of find a way to create that tension and maintain that tension. So what's worked for you? Or what have you seen work from a way of creating tension, but also holding it long enough that something happens under tension?
Yeah. So we talk about tension in the trains we run internally, pointing to the actual object of an elastic band if you're over in EMEA, or we call it a rubber band in North America. Without any tension in that object, it just exists as a limp, lifeless, for lack of a better word, flaccid object.
Yeah.
And then there needs to be the right amount of tension to give it shape. And then too much tension, it snaps.
Yeah.
So not enough tension is bad. Too much tension is bad, but it is an unavoidable element that has to breathe life into any relationships. And if you examine relationships with family, relationships with partners, relationships with friends, the most fortified relationships, those that can withstand the ups and the downs, have all come out the other side of tension. And you take that life principle to your salespeople and say, hey, like, have you pressure tested whether or not this deal even has energy or legs? And if you haven't even attempted to fairly induce some tension, then arguably you're chasing a false positive, a red herring. This is built on a house of cards. So, okay, we can agree, yes, relationships that are mature and healthy have tension in them. Well, how do you fairly introduce it when you're some random schmo who's got a stigma that they're trying to swindle the prospect or the recipient of their attempts? How do you ingratiate them, or ingratiate yourself, I should say, in a way that doesn't cause backlash? And one of the things that I've learned over my years, and what I've attempted to, inspire people who go through my trainings to do, you have a right to deliver a hard truth if it's not fear-mongering and bullying. And a hard truth is the operative term. Well, it's hard because it exposes something that is uncomfortable, is unsettling about their status quo. But it is truthful, and it is not your opinion, because it is grounded in numbers. It is grounded in research you've done. And that process both sucks to do. It's not fun. It's not sexy. But if you have any attempt to still earn the right to be in that room 20 seconds later, 60 seconds later, 5 minutes later, it's because the receiver, especially if they're at an altitude of gyms like a C-suite, this is another CVI phrase. It's I know, as Jim Druckery, former CEO, that you know as the rep at Finastra or Gong, that we know about the same pressures that I care 4 times more about talking about than anything that's going on in your product. So insulating yourself from the backlash or the violent reaction of who is this rando that's calling my baby ugly? Instead, it's, wow, you've clearly done your research independently of your own attempts to try and sell. You read our 10K, you listened to our earnings call. In fact, you have the latest industry reports from McKinsey that talk about challenges either I'm aware of or heck, I didn't even know I should be aware of, but now you've got my attention. And you can present that hard truth that induces tension fairly without being a jerk.
And I like that. And that's, we used to do that through questions, right? We used to question, try and find the gap. What is the gap? What is the gap? We'd go and ask all that laundry list back in the day, the good old days of selling. And now, with insight selling, as we think about what we're trying to do with Challenger and corporate vision and stuff, is presenting an opinion or presenting some data, some facts, contrasting it to what you know is true about their business. So here's a conversion rate, here's a number of performance, here's where you are, this is the difference. How do you feel about that difference? It's that contrast, that difference between the existing state and the desired state, or something along those lines, that creates that element of tension. But that creates separation, and that creates like the elastic band or the rubber band feel. I like that. But it's easy for people to let themselves off the hook. Like this is what I find. This is what I find people are really good at. They just we'll get to that next quarter, or it's just we don't have the budget for that right now, and so they'll try and dissipate that tension. How do you keep that tension on? Like, what's your tactics?
It's interesting you had mentioned. We used to get there through discovery, or hey, we'll get if you're the receiver of that tension-inducing hard truth. Yeah, okay, we got a lot of other things. New York Times 8 years ago published an article talking about the dwindling state of attention span. And that was 8 years ago. That was before the pandemic. That was before maybe we all have now 2 laptops, 2 phones, work from home. We're juggling so much more complexity than ever before. I'd hazard a guess, which is backed by a Microsoft study that they ran. The average business executive today has an 8-second attention span.
Yeah.
So how do you stoke the flames and not let those embers totally fizzle out? It's because you have a war chest of what we refer to as points of view, POV. And the POV has to be, again, enhanced with numbers that expose risk, obstacle, threat to the receiver's status quo. And we'll talk now about, inherently, none of us love change. None of us are going to Starbucks or a coffee shop every day and getting a different drink every time. None of us are thinking, okay, we have our primary care physician or our dentist that we've been going to, but let's go to a different one every time. Or let's not choose to spend our weekends reorganizing everything in our closet or in our kitchens. No, we appreciate the efficiencies of predictability and routine and structure that comes with the status quo. And what you have to do to will people out of that inertia is to continue to tactfully but fairly remind them why their status quo is untenable. Not because, again, you're bullying them or you're scaring them.
Yeah.
Well, you are scaring them, but you're doing it in a way that's fair because you're doing it by unearthing the hard truths and the facts and the numbers that make them have to come to their senses. If I stay in my status quo, I'm going to be crass, up shit creek without a paddle. And while change sucks, the cost of change is far less than the cost of doing nothing.
So do we use pain or pleasure? Because you mentioned there, we don't want to come across as bullying. We don't want to come across as a doom monger, the end is nigh type thing, because it's been overused. At the same time, we know that dangling the carrot isn't going to get the donkey to run along. Got to give it a little whack. Like, what's your thought? How do we balance that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm like catching myself. We're however many episodes or minutes into this episode, and I've been like, it's pain, tension, obstacle. You're like, God, this guy's having a bad day. No, I swear, listeners out there, I'm a pretty upbeat, happy-go-lucky guy, but I've just read the books. So Daniel Kahneman is, one of the sort of honorary, named, enshrined, etched in stone forebearers of bringing psych to business. In fact, his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, won the Nobel Prize in 2002 for his prospect theory. But fascinatingly, Kahneman is classically trained as a psychologist. So what the hell is he doing winning an award in economics? And let's just play this scenario out so listeners can appreciate, what's actually at play with this theory. So Dan, I have to suspect that at some point in your lifetime, you've been at a pub, in the mall, at a restaurant, you reach in your back pocket, you're looking for that 20 quid, and you're like, where the hell did that go? Like, right?
Yep.
And how'd you feel? Like, give me some examples of adjectives, sentiments, descriptors in that moment.
Frustrated as heck because I know the money's there, or like I'm sure I'm put it in my pocket. I'm questioning myself and getting angry at myself. I'm also now very thirsty, so I'm getting because I'm like, what the heck? Like, and then I'm embarrassed because I have to ask somebody else for it.
I mean, huge things that you just identified. You're embarrassed. You're pissed. You're thirsty. You're angry. All of those are legitimate. Let's flip the script now. Cool. You're walking down the street. Maybe you're back in the stadium, in a mall, who knows, airport, and you stumble upon, unexpectedly, the 20 quid. We've all had that happen in our life. And Dan, I've seen you nod. So how'd you feel in that moment of unexpectedly inheriting or finding 20 quid?
Well, I'll use the scratch card example. Like if I win a scratch card, I'm like, oh, win 20 quid. Which doesn't happen very often. But I have a little pile of scratch cards that I've won. And I just leave it there for, and then like however long. I'll get to that later. So it's nice. But I'll deal with that later.
It's nice. Totally. And feels good. Sure. So Kahneman, what he does to absolutely stand our preference for logic and linearity in the world, he stands that on his head. He says, okay, we can all agree. None of us have to be world economists to appreciate whether you lose or gain 20 quid. Monetarily, economically, 20 quid is 20 quid. Yeah. So you would think the intensity, the magnitude of that pissed, anger, frustrated sensation you had when you lost would be 1-to-1 with the magnitude of, I feel great. And as you illustrated perfectly, it's not 1-to-1. Psychologically, we're hardwired to assign 2 to 3 times more value for experiences that are framed as loss than in gain. So let that sink in. That's how our brains are hardwired. We can't overcome that. Well, shit. How should that then not find its way infiltrating into our sales prospecting, into our marketing, to how our websites look, that we are solving for a risk, a threat, an obstacle, a hurdle And again, we don't want to leave money on the table. So we want to complement. Here's all the pitfalls that you can help avoid by using Finastra or using Gong. And by the way, we'll complement that with the gains you can achieve. But it's how you sequence them together that Kahneman is so instrumental in. And I'll give one more real life example and then I'll shut up. For listeners on this episode, I'm told, I'm not a parent, but for listeners who are parents, I'm told that having a child is arguably the greatest source of joy you can imagine, and truly like unprecedented levels of joy. And you contrast how you feel with like it even gives me the chills to even talk about this, but the unthinkable, the unimaginable, the unconscionable possibility of losing a child, and just weigh out how powerful those emotions are, gaining and losing children. Or I'll do something a little more silly. What happens when you lose that one pair of socks or that matching pair when you're like doing laundry and you can't find the rogue sock and you want to put the pair back together? I'll take my house down to the studs looking for that. But if my mom gets me a pair of socks for Hanukkah, I'm like, socks? Mom, are you kidding? Really? Like you phoning it in? What's going on? So over to you, Dan.
No, that's hilarious because this morning I was watching cartoons with my daughter at a time which shouldn't have been watching cartoons, but we were all jet lagged. And we were watching a show, a cartoon, it's a movie, it's a Czech movie called Odd Sock Eaters. And it's a cartoon about these socks that go around and they only eat one sock, but they steal a single sock. There you go. I can highly recommend it. It's hilarious. But no, you're right. Like there's, I'm a parent. I have a 3.5-year-old daughter who, on the positive side, absolutely light of my life. But like you say, if you think about the negative things, I can't read articles, I can't watch movies that even hint at that kind of thing because I have a visceral reaction throughout my entire body, which just fills me with absolute dread. Like I can't explain it. It's just an absolute paralyzing feeling that just runs through me, and that's it, right? It's that we experience the fear of pain or the pain in a far greater aspect than we do the pleasure side of things. And I think that's it. I think it's we need the pain element. We need it to create drive, to create action, to create urgency, right? Think about that 20 quid. I'm going to do more to stop somebody taking 20 pounds off me than going and buying a scratch card. I may win. But we can't live there because otherwise it's just doom and gloom, right? So we still need to dangle the carrot. We still need to talk about the positive aspects. But again, if we only talk about positive aspects, I've got a really good way of saying, okay, but that sounds really nice. I will get around to it. And it's not on my urgent list. And salespeople are always about, how do we drive urgency? How do we drive urgency? Well, it's that, right? It's how do we create a painful situation where lack of change is more impactful than the pain of going through change. And then how do we drive urgency? By attaching that to some kind of trigger or event or something along those lines. I love the thinking fast, slow book. I would play some of the games. Readers, go and read it. Or if you're like me and you need Audible to read it to you, then get it read. But the Thinking Fast and Slow book is a great one. Any other books in the kind of behavioral economics sphere? Like, what are the other ones that you would recommend on that?
Robert Cialdini's influence is fantastic. And I mean, I think that there's some other, huge takeaways there.
Yeah.
Between those two, you'd have more than enough pages to start. And if you need more, then just shoot me a note on LinkedIn. I'll give you my entire reading list. But those are sacred scrolls to begin. See if it actually has, staying power with your interest. One of the things, I'm thinking about when you're talking about, hey, but how do I get urgency in deals? I really appreciate your sort of takeaway, Dan. Yes, there's a time and a place to give the carrot, to talk about the benefit, but just to really harp on the status quo bias that we are also hardwired to feel. There's so many shackles that maybe we're unaware of that make us prisoners to the status quo, or in cases of trying to sell against an incumbent solution that make the buyer reluctant to want to do anything different, even if they can appreciate that their existing solution is deficient and that yours is better. There is some stability that they prefer by not having to uproot where they're at. So when we talk about selling tension, using Kahneman's award-winning psychology, that is the wick. That if you imagine sort of this wick going into a larger powder keg that's going to blow up the status quo, we need something powerful and potent enough as a catalyst to get these people off their ass. because until you jolt them
Yep.
to a heightened sense of, oh, I can't continue to operate, they're just going to keep you at arm's distance. And you guys are all playing against, is it a monthly? Is it a quarterly? Is it an annual quota? Time is not on our side in this profession as sales. So how do you tactfully manage the clock and still not just be pegged as, God, it is just doom and gloom with Danny? No, there's benefit, but the sequencing is critical.
Yep. I think that the timing piece is important. The tension piece is important. And I think there's a couple of things. Here's how I teach it. There's two things I'll say. And I can get away with the one because I can put on that cheeky Britishness, and which it comes out extremely well when I'm in sales situations. And the first one is the realization that most people are about, let's say it was 60% down the buying process before we even engage with sales. So even further than that in many occasions, right? So people are coming to us, they've already done a whole bunch of the work. So they engage with us, and if it looks like they're leaning towards status quo or they're kind of kicking the tires and stuff, I like to ask a question which puts people on the spot. And it's quite, you could take it as quite a mean question, but the question I would say, and Danny, I'll say it too, is I just lean in and just go quiet a little bit and I'd say, so how long have you been thinking about this? And then smile, and then smile, and then just shut up, right? Because you're putting people on the spot to realize that they've just been procrastinating a decision. And actually, if they have that realization that this is something that is important to them, but they've been waiting, then like putting them on the spot like that, but not for too long, right? Because if you leave them on there and they just get uncomfortable, then you've got to know when to come back off. But I think my friends are also master economists. They took me, so my stag do was 7 years, married this year, trying to do quick maths, like 7.5, 8 years ago. They took me to Wales. Right? I don't even know Wales, but the Welsh coast on the Atlantic, get my geography right, or maybe the Irish coast, I don't know. It's cold, right? it's everything is cold in the British Isles, but it's cold and it's very jagged. And what they did is they took me to do something called co-steering. Right? Because they know two things about me. Number one, they know that I like a little bit of adrenaline and doing crazy things like that. And then number two is they also know I'm terrified of heights. And so what co-steering does, it kind of gets you dressed in a wetsuit and buoyancy aids and stuff like that, helmet, and it gets you to climb up a cliff and then jump off into freezing cold sea. So it's great fun, right? And you start off at like a couple of feet, a meter, something like that, and you jump in. And so you get smashed around by some big waves. They tell you to put the feet out. If you're my best friend, he gets hit in the face by a cliff, blood all over his face a week out before the wedding. All good fun, right? But progressively, you go higher and higher up the cliff. And the last one, you're like 30 stories up. You're not, but it must be like 3 meters. But it felt like that, right? And there's only two people that are stupid enough to do it. My brother, who's just mad, and me, because I have to do it, because I'm the stag, right? So I get up there, and I'm looking down at what is basically sheer death. Death. It's only bad things can happen when you look down and you're so far up. People are tiny little floating ants in front of you. There's razors for rock face, right? If you slip and fall, there's no piece of skin that is staying on your body. And you're standing on this kind of really kind of not very flat platform. And all you need to do is jump, right? That's it. It's this. And so that's where the tension is. The tension is there. And you've only got two options to come down, right? You've got progress or going back down the pathway that you kind of got to there. And that's what we do. As salespeople, we take people to this position, right? And we take them to this decision point. And if you've educated them and if you've got them into this point, this is the decision. This is what you want people to do. And you talked about fairly creating this tension or reducing this tension. If we've created it, we need to hold on to that so that they make the decision and the right decision, right? And here's what my friends did. My friends, well, you know what friends do. Your friends would probably be the exact same. They wouldn't say, oh, Dan, it's going to be amazing if you jump. It's going to be the best experience of your life. No, they would shout abuse and hurl abuse. I mean, it's like the pain side of things. And so you could kind of back off, right? They allowed me to. I did jump. It was a phenomenal feeling. Like, I'm so glad I did. But it's that creating that tension and allowing people to make that decision, a progress decision. But it's scary. It's scary. It's scary for me to dive off. I didn't dive off, jumped in with feet. And it's probably only 3 foot. So it wasn't that scary. But also as a buyer, as somebody who buys technology or training or whatever it is, I've got a fear of getting stuff wrong, right? That's my fear. I'm not fear of death or losing all my skin. I have a fear of getting things wrong. Like, is that the main fear that we're coming up against when it's status quo, or is there other things that are at play that we need to be aware of when trying to get people beyond status quo?
Yeah. So when you talk about the analogy of cliff jumping, if we think about that in the state of a sales cycle, we rolled out this winter a wide change message should be used early in the sales cycle to unstick someone from their tendency to not want to jump off the cliff, or in this case,
Yeah.
to even entertain buying a solution like Gong. The point, though, is that it's going to take more than just that first friend of yours who's going to rib you if you don't jump. They're going to have to continue to remind you of the tension if you don't jump, in the same way that just because you nail as a Gong seller the why change message on your discovery call, no, tension needs to be trickled throughout the entire sales cycle. And some of that tension is cranked way up, some of it's cranked, more modestly. And when we talk about the tension that we're trying to expose, especially midway and later through the sales cycle, is tension that illuminates or magnifies even the contrast between current state and future state.
Mm-hmm.
So in your current state, without jumping, Dan, here are the, we'll call them pitfalls, or, here are the holes, maybe the gaps in you as a human being. No, I'm just kidding. But like, what is, I'd say, Dan's status quo, or what is the prospect status quo in their current state? And then amplifying, why have all of the challenges, risks, threats, I don't know, we'll say gaps, how have those been resolved? So we want to close those. Again, I'm framing things as we're resolving something before all of a sudden then Dan, who jumps off this cliff, gains this. Yes, you do gain things. And yes, the prospect gains things. But first and foremost, for Kahneman psychology to apply, we want to make that contrast between those bookends of current state and future state as big as possible. To borrow a different analogy, we talk a lot about, think of a car salesperson who is selling Ferraris, luxury vehicle. Well, any car salesperson at the Ferrari dealer who's worth their salt, when someone walks through the front door, the first question they should be asking to determine what are the bookends between current state and future state is, what do you drive today? And the reason is, well, if that prospect walks into the dealer and says, hey, like, I'm here at the Ferrari dealership and I drive a Pinto. Well, we can then amplify quite easily the dimensions of contrast between a Pinto and a Ferrari. Alternatively, if another prospect comes in, you ask the exact same question, what are you driving today? They say, well, I'm currently driving a Maserati. All of a sudden, creating contrast, still with Kahneman psychology, becomes much harder. They're both luxury vehicles. They're both Italian made. They both go really fast. They both have status. So how do you delineate between what gaps a Maserati driver has that they could only ever resolve or plug with a Ferrari?
Which of those is the easiest sale? And I don't know if you sold Ferraris. If you have, and this is an unfair question, you get the advantage, and don't tell anybody. But which do you think is easier? Is it easier to sell a Ferrari to someone with a Pinto or with a Maserati?
What I would say is, I'll answer it in a roundabout way and then call bullshit if you don't like this answer.
Yeah.
Yeses in sales are great. Yes, I want to make a change. No's are also great. So in the case of I drive a Maserati, no, I don't want to drive a Ferrari. You want to get to a yes or a no as a binary, objective, concrete answer from the prospect as fast as humanly possible, so you're not burning daylight chasing these false positives. So I think in the case of you have the Pinto driver, there is ample contrast. There's ample pain that could be resolved. They feel like a schmo. Oh my God, they can't go out on a date, or it's breaking down. Hell, they're putting their life into their own hands every time they take it out. They're not going to have any of those issues anymore with a Ferrari. If they're driving a Maserati, it's harder to determine, well, what is the contrast between current state and future state? And if there isn't that big of a difference, well, shit, maybe a Ferrari isn't the right solution for them right now. And I would rather get to yes or no versus spinning my wheels and maybe, because maybes will kill you.
That's a beautiful answer. I didn't know we were going to go there, but that is a perfect answer. A long time ago when I was a seller, I sold advertising, I sold digital advertising. I'm one of those people, and I apologize for the rest of my life for having done so. But we used to target, like, our qualification criteria were: question number one, are they already spending money on advertising? Like, that was our main qualification criteria. And if they are, then great, they can spend more, or they can move their budget across. Because that was one sale, right? If they weren't spending money on advertising, you had two sales to make. You have number one, you have to sell the idea of advertising. And then number two, you have to sell yourself. So it's interesting. Like you say, we want to get to a yes or no. The Pinto to Ferrari sale is potentially two sales. You're selling the idea of a supercar, and then you're selling Ferrari. Whereas Maserati driver, they're already at that point where, okay, I am the level of this. And it's just switching them over potentially. Like you say, you need to get to a yes or no, but interesting. So from a targeting perspective, I wouldn't necessarily go around targeting Pintos. Maybe you go to like BMW, Mercedes. It's a smaller jump.
There you go. Totally.
But there you go. You mentioned Cialdini. You mentioned contrast. This was probably one of my first books, and it's the first book I recommend to sellers to read, in terms of, like, if you're only going to read one book on influence and persuasion, is Cialdini's Influence. At one point, I had 3 copies on my desk, and I only have 2. I gave the one away somewhere. I'll probably give the other ones away at some point. It's a natural cycle. What for you? What is there anything in that book? I mean, we talked about contrast just a moment ago, but is there anything else in that book that really stands out for you, and how do you use that ethically in selling? Because I know a lot of those techniques can be used unethically, but how have you used some of those concepts, and how do you do it in a kind of holistic way?
It's interesting that you talk about the ethics of using psychology, whether it's from Cialdini, whether it's from Kahneman. The other person who I failed to mention, I'd be remiss if I didn't give them a nod, is Matt Dixon. So Matt Dixon, if you don't know that name, Matt is one of the original authors of Challenger Sale. Last year, he actually came out with his latest research with his partner, Ted, called the Jolt Effect, which examines buyer indecision. Well, in my trainings, I use the word to jolt people. I say, let's weaponize the human psyche. And that is a polarizing term, right? Like, I'm not a violent person, and I think that weaponize has some like wartime references. So forgive me if you are sort of, I don't know, emboldened by that statement. It's hard to be a seller. And it's not a surprise that people talk about using either sports or war and battle as analogies that talk about, hey, like, what is the job of going out in the trenches every day and getting kicked in the teeth and hearing no 99 times out of 100? And I think why, when I use any of these books or these techniques, I think in a lot of ways, because I viscerally felt that suck. People out there are doing noble work as salespeople. They're trying to solve your problems. Not all of them, but a lot of them, I think, are out there trying to peddle something that inherently is for good. And if, having been in those trenches with those people in my new world in enablement, I can soften some of those blows, or I can give you ways to use science and psychology to improve your chances of achieving success. I will burn the midnight oil. I will go to the mat every time for that. I wouldn't say it's a subversive manipulation. I would say that if you have the information, the science in front of you, why make it harder for yourself?
Yeah, I love that. It is weapons. It is jolt, and I think we have to, this is where you mentioned at the beginning. It's the art of it, right? It's how do you deliver an assertive, quite aggressive, potentially, I'm trying to think of a better word, but a strong message. How do you deliver it artfully so it lands but doesn't feel like an attack? That's what we need sellers to do, right? We need to have that way of just wordsmithing these messages. I think that's why, like you said about enablement and teaching people how to message things, especially in their engagements, to do it in a way where we're able to commit and kind of get across gravitas, but also a relationship and a general best interest in people's hands. This is hard, man. Sellers, like you say, it's noble work, and anything we can do to enable them and help them in this journey, then I think it's huge. It's absolutely huge.
if you take a literal interpretation of Kahneman, you're like, oh, okay, I'm just going to sell pain. And you come out swinging, no one's going to want to buy from you because you're going to get pegged as an asshole. So
I
to your
remember
point,
teaching insurance people back in the day, and we used to draw this graph, right? And it was like, here's your money now, here's your money when you're going to retire because you got no pension. And the question we had was, how do you like living off cat food and crackers? It's like, oh man, but that's insurance selling. It's like, oh, nasty. It's not enjoyable, right? It's definitely not enjoyable. Slight technical issue there, but Danny, welcome back. So Danny, here's one question now, and I know we're kind of almost on time, and I think we've covered so many things. How do you work with your sellers in terms of presenting different levels of options? Is it, think about paradox of choice as well, Barry Schwartz, like too much choice, we get indecision. Do you present, some people like to present a budget option and a higher price option, and so you create that contrast. How do you think about pricing and presenting options?
Yeah, I'll use the example of how do I sell my messaging? How do I sell my approach to sales internally? Because I'm a seller.
Yeah.
It just so happens I don't sell to the paying customers. I sell internally to, at times, what are brutal, ruthless, cynical, upmarket strat sellers.
Yeah.
And what I would say is absolutely what you allude to. I give them options. And the first option is, here are the facts. Right now, when you apply this why change message, the message that weaponizes behavioral economics and buyer psychology, we have the data from Gong that shows when used during discovery, it improves your win rates by 28% and compresses your sales cycle by 7 days, because the conversion rate from discovery to demo, well, that conversion rate goes up by 9%. If you don't want to use those numbers, even though I know you guys all want to go to Costa Rica for President's Club, if you want to do your own thing, no harm, no foul. I just wanted you to have the facts. So that's generally in terms of options. I really try and avoid ultimatums. I really try to avoid guns to people's heads. And I would say if you can present them with options A, B, and C, back to where we started this episode with Christopher Nolan, how can you incept them as best as possible? At the end of the day, if you want to walk away from 28% win rate, incremental improvements, and compression cycles and larger deals, okay, walk away from that.
I love it. So this is what we always have to remember: is if you're listening to this as a sales enablement professional, we are sellers. We are sellers of ideas. We are sellers of behavior. We are sellers of change to people. Potentially, we have to be, like you say, Dan. Well, those who can do, those who can't go into sales enablement. We have to be the best in the world, because to sell to a salesperson is probably one of the hardest things, especially when we're selling education and enablement and those kind of things. So I think the way you've done it there is you've presented options, right? You've given data, so you've got the logical sell, you've got the emotional aspect, so it's dangling the carrot at President's Club. You've done the takeaway piece, so you kind of say, if you don't want any of those things, you kind of, the pain aspect of things, you are a walking, talking embodiment of this stuff, and you're applying it every day, which is it's impressive. It's ninja. It's like Jedi type stuff. You're a dangerous communicator, Danny. I like it.
One thing you had alluded to, and then we'll wrap, since I've overstayed my welcome, Dan, is this idea of the art and the science of sales, right? Like the literal interpretation of Kahneman. Okay, you'd over-rotate and index too heavily into the pain and be pegged as a jerk. The art is the finesse. It is how we sort of, with sleight of hand, use language to thread this needle. And sometimes it's razor thin. So one of my favorite closing lines was an executive talking about how, I know he sells, said something to the effect of, listen, I'm not calling your baby ugly. It just so happens that I know this other baby, this other ugly baby, and your baby just looks a little like it.
That's too funny. That is too funny. We've got to create that tension. And again, if we go back to Challenger, the difference between Challenger and relationship, everyone builds relationships. The difference is, for those people who are able to create that tension, is to present something that doesn't put the relationship at harm, but shows that there's something more important in the relationship, and that is progress. That is change for the better. That is advancement. And if I go back to my question, it's probably something that people have been thinking about for a little while, and we need to now hold them accountable to make that decision and take a step forward. Hopefully not off a jagged cliff edge, but into some form of progression and business solution, ideally. Danny, call to action. Like, people are listening to this, if they got through to this point, then clearly they're interested in this topic, or they just think that we're too incredibly engaging individuals. I'd probably say the former, though, that the topic is pretty interesting. You mentioned a couple of books. Where would you say get started? Go and do something. What would be your word of advice?
Examine in your pipeline for the deals that you've actually committed in your forecast. How many of them, if you actually audit your interactions, how many of them have had moments of tension? And I think you'd be startled to realize, oh my God, are all of my opportunities built on a house of cards? And if so, well, if you're running a traditional fiscal year, it's July, so it's the start to Q3. If you're running an off-kilter schedule, well, examine where in the quarter you are, because at least you're in H2. There's still time to course correct and pressure test whether or not any of these are, again, going to advance all the way through the end zone because, well, any monkey could do it, or are they going to advance because you have calibrated your approach in such a way that fairly induces that tension?
Love it. Check your pipeline, see how much tension you've created, and then contrast it to your close lost versus status quo and no change. Love it. Danny, you've been full of some amazing wisdom. I love how read up on this topic you are. I consider myself schooled today. Thank you very much. It's been an absolute education. I appreciate your time. How can people hear more from you? What's the best way to keep in touch with kind of your thoughts and ramblings?
Dan, I am a fellow Dan or Danny podcast host myself. So every week we come out at Gong with an episode from our own podcast called Reveal. Take a look there. And as always, shoot me an in-mail message if there are things you want to hear more of, less of, or you just want to nerd out, as Dan talks about, on any of these topics, because there is no way you can satiate my appetite for this kind of thing.
Great stuff. Keep sharing the knowledge, Danny, and anything you get, send it my way. Student for life. Absolutely. Appreciate your time today. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
You know what I think, Ron? I think that was a sales call. Good job, buddy.
So you're going to buy a subscription?
No, I already get the Times.
Bye-bye.